Well, when Matthias asked me to talk about liberty, of course, my default position is always war, because that's what I write about. So I thought I would talk about Marathon, but I am aware that there are classicists in the room who are likely to take issue with my interpretation. And the only explanation I can give for my imprudence, since we took so much emphasis on prudence when we were looking at Venice, is that Winston Churchill came back from the Boer War thinking about going up to university rather than going into Parliament, which he eventually did. But when told that he would have to take a paper in Greek, he decided that Parliament was the better option. And he said, you see, having had the enormous honour of commanding British regular forces in the field, I cannot be expected to sit down and learn Greek irregular verbs. And those of you who know the short story Tobermory by the English writer Saki will know about the fate of the professor who tries to teach an elephant in the Berlin Zoo German irregular verbs, something you might want to look into. So why do I start with the Battle of Marathon? Why do I start with this? The only time I've ever used a PowerPoint at an Engelsberg meeting. It's an inscription that survives, published only very recently, I think in the summer of 2010, and it commends the Athenians who fell at the Battle of Marathon fighting the Persians 2,500 years ago. Now, the survival of this casualty list is due entirely to the interests of an Athenian millionaire called Herodes Atticus, who lived in the 2nd century AD and was tutor briefly to Marcus Aurelius, and he had the monument installed in his country house in the eastern Peloponnese. What's striking about this monument is that it's the first, I think it's the first to enumerate the death of ordinary people and not just aristocrats. Ordinary people who've died fighting side by side with aristocrats for the common right to live their own life. Now, we're so used to such inscriptions to the fallen from the 2 world wars that the novelty of this approach, I think, might elude us. But the Athenians thought it was worth recording the names of the lowest as well as the highest and the celebration of sacrifice that they made, because these men, if they were not equal in each other's eyes by virtue of wealth or status, were certainly equal in the eyes of the Persians. They were equal targets. And in this case, the few really actually means the few. We don't know how many Persians died at the Battle of Marathon, but we do know how many Athenians, only 192. Now, of course, when we remember the Greco-Persian Wars, I think most of us probably don't think necessarily of Marathon. We think of the second invasion of Greece in the Battle of Thermopylae. And the novelist William Golding, after visiting the battlefield, wrote that a little of Leonidas lives in the fact that I can go where I like and write what I like. He contributed to set us free. Of course, Leonidas was the Spartan king who held the pass at Thermopylae against the Persians. My students, when I still taught students, knew the battle from Zack Snyder's movie 300, which was panned by the critics, but was a great box office success. The Greek government officially complained that its homoerotic content might mislead audiences into thinking that Sparta was the gay superpower of the ancient world. And the Iranian government actually lodged a complaint with UNESCO about the depiction of Xerxes, the Persian king, as a sexually ambivalent, if not cross-dressing, freak of nature. But Thermopylae remains, I think, the touchstone, as does Marathon, these 2 great battles. And you'll say, quite rightly, it's a kind of myth that we have incorporated into our thinking about liberty. But it's a very old myth, and I think it starts really with Montaigne's friend Etienne Le Boëtie, who, as far as I know, was the first person in the modern era to see the Greco-Persian Wars as a fight of liberty, Western liberty, against Eastern tyranny. Liberty that requires, and this is the point I come to about war, liberty and revolution, by the way, in the modern era, a liberty that requires sacrifice, because without sacrifice, you can't achieve very much. Now, Thomas Hobbes, cynical as always, called the sacrifice the principle of absurdity, to which no living creature is subject but man only. So it behoves me, I think, to ask, where does this privilege of absurdity come from? Is it biological? Is it in our DNA, biological DNA? Is it in our cultural DNA? Interestingly, I think the Greeks asked that question themselves, or certainly Pericles does, in the funeral oration, to which mention has already been made. Of course, they didn't have Darwinism. They weren't able to talk about selflessness and how sacrifice in social groups actually ensures the continuation of the group. But Pericles makes the point that the Spartans were different. The sacrifices they made were different from those of the Athenians. So the Spartan willingness to die for each other was rooted in family, and armies were organized by clans and kinship groups. Sometimes a grandfather and a father and a son would fight in sight of each other in the battlefield. The extended family was privileged over the nuclear family. Boys were removed from their nuclear families at the age of 7. So in a sense, Leonidas' band of brothers in the famous day in Thermopylae was the product of, I suppose, a social experiment. Pericles, talking about the sacrifice the Athenians made, said that it was more a collective voluntary effort that derived from the privilege of citizenship. And to be a citizenship was to be free, but freedom demanded at certain times sacrifices. And there is this idea of translating the concept of philia, love of a country, into eros, a kind of erotic love. I derive this from the writings of Paul Ludwig, who says that eros, in certain senses, can be translated into a lust. This is what makes the Athenians perhaps distinctive. Not just a love of freedom, but a lust for freedom. Not just a love of learning, but a lust for learning. Now, it is quite right, as we were told before the coffee break, that liberty is not unique to the West. It is actually, I think, hardwired into our DNA. There seems to be a need. That is the need to value ourselves and our customs, and especially our gods. And John Locke tells the story of a city of Tartars who surrendered their persons, their wives, their children, and their wealth to their Chinese conquerors. But when they were ordered to cut off the plait of hair, which by national custom they wore on their heads, they took up arms and were slaughtered to a man. And for Locke, this story, whether it's true or not, demonstrated that all people privilege the liberty to be themselves. I think what makes Western political thinking, not necessarily Western practice, but Western political thinking different, what creates what I call a Western differential, is that in the 18th and 19th centuries, we stopped talking about custom and being, liberty in terms of being, but liberty in terms of becoming. Liberty in terms of you had to fight in order to be truly free. And this concept of becoming, you find in what I think is a wonderful myth that Hegel introduces. Hegel doesn't introduce many wonderful things, but this is one of them in the only book which is actually readable, The Philosophy of History, which unfortunately isn't read because it's so politically incorrect these days. But Hegel wrote that history was the story of freedom becoming conscious of itself. That's an extraordinary, I think, ambitious interpretation of history. And what did he mean by that? Well, originally one man was free. There was a man, of course, the pharaoh or the emperor of China. Then he talked about how the city-state, some people, the 1/5 or whatever percentage of people were free. Then he talked about Christianity, which promised that in heaven at least everybody would be free. And finally, with the French Revolution in mind, he talked about how you became free by your own efforts. And there were two ways in which the West thought you could become free, and one was revolution, and the other was war. Patrick Henry's famous cry of the American Revolution, "Give me liberty or death." And revolution? Well, I've just been reading a recent book on the Cato conspiracy. This was a conspiracy to assassinate the entire British cabinet while they were having dinner. Not a bad idea these days, but not for the reasons that the revolutionaries put forward. And that when Thistlewood, who was one of the leaders, was executed, publicly hanged, he famously said, "It is better to die a free man than to live a slave." And the Russian ambassador's wife at the time was puzzled by this remark. She said, what on earth did he mean? It's better to die a free man than live a slave. She was a highly intelligent person, and her husband was cosmopolitan, much more intelligent and cosmopolitan than the present Russian ambassador in London, it has to be said. But she literally, as a Russian, could not understand this concept at all. This concept in the West, of course, goes back to Caesar, to Brutus, to our imagination of the Republicans. So my point, as I conclude, is that freedom is, I think, for the West, rooted in an idea that we can only be truly human if we're free, either in the sense of being, that is, of individual self-worth, or in the sense of becoming, that is, freedom pulls us towards a future in which we'll become better people. That doesn't mean that George Bush was right in 2003, talking of Afghanistan, to talk about the non-negotiable demands of human dignity. We have made freedom into a kind of fetish, in a sense. We've made it into a right. We think it should be exported to everybody, sometimes at the point of a gun. That's not the point, I think, at all. I am not a liberal internationalist. I have no wish to bring freedom to Afghanistan. It's something that the Afghans will have to do for themselves. The reason why I think these Western myths and the story I've just told you are important is because of our own history, and because of the history of war by the West, partly against itself in the last 200 years. And I will end on this conclusion that we don't know how universal human rights are. It's impossible to even prove from the historical record that human beings have rights. We don't stand at the end of history like Francis Fukuyama looking back to see the inevitability of the fight for freedom. But we do know, of course, from our own historical record, the appalling consequences of believing that people don't have a right to freedom. I hope that's within my 15 minutes. Good. Thank you.
Chris, why do we in the West feel closer to Athens than to Sparta?
Or Jerusalem?
I think we do.
Sorry? To Athens rather than Sparta? Well, not always the case, I think. There have been times when Sparta has been seen as more virtuous than the Athenians. But yes, I mean, in the Cold War, Marshall himself, General Marshall, said that this is a struggle between Athens and Sparta, with the Soviet Union being Sparta and the United States being Athens. That's not always the perception that non-Americans might take of the United States.
Is this correct?
No, but I mean, these analogies are useful because I think they resonate with people who've read history and even studied Greek irregular verbs, but they're no more correct than any other analogy.
Who believes strongest in freedom then, Athens or Sparta?
If you ask Machiavelli, he had no interest in the Greeks at all. It was all the Romans and the Roman virtues, and Brutus in particular is the great hero of much of early modern European history.
Thank you.
Thank you.